Transforming Lives conference. Today our lineup begins with recovery specialist Alison McGrath. As an ex-military and A&E nurse, Alison deep dives into why and how she became so ill, why our healthcare providers are traumatised and at breaking point but dare not leave, and why so many end up knocking on the door of the Chrysalis Effect. It took the Chrysalis Effect approach for her to recover and find her purpose to help nurses regain agency over their health and well-being. So let me tell you a little bit more about Alison. Alison began her career as a nurse, graduating from the University of Edinburgh in 1993. Her nursing school instilled in her a deeply held belief in a holistic approach to health and healing, and a lifelong fascination with the mind-body-spirit connection. However, nursing also left her with a long-term, damaging legacy of perfectionism and a work ethic of never stopping until everyone else's needs were met. Alison's guiding principle as a nurse was in connecting and being with her patients, offering support and guidance back to health and wholeness as they navigated a dehumanising healthcare system. After several years of struggling to fulfil this core value within NHS nursing, she suffered her first health crash. She left nursing practice to study for a PhD, graduating in 2006 with a thesis entitled "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" towards an understanding of leaving nursing. In the following years, Alison's health deteriorated and she struggled to combine motherhood, work, caring for elderly parents, and being both a patient and an informal carer in what she considers a dehumanising system. In 2018, she was diagnosed with fibromyalgia and was devastated to be told that there was no treatment plan and she should give up hope and adapt instead. Her nurse training told her to keep looking for the root causes, and she found her answers through the Chrysalis Effect, through the recovery pathway. Alison is now fully recovered and works with us as a trauma-informed specialist recovery practitioner. And in this work, Alison has found a role in which she can fulfil those early nursing values, reassuring new recoverers in her role at the Chrysalis Effect, and supporting and guiding her clients and patients through their own recovery journeys. We're all well aware of the pressure our healthcare providers are dealing with since the pandemic. And in this presentation, Alison draws on her experience as a nurse, on her PhD thesis, and on recent recovery work with the Chrysalis Effect, where she started to explore why nurses are such an overrepresented group among our clients. And whether you're a nurse or not yourself, she will show how the path to recovery requires us to find the strength to take off our superhero capes, navigate the pitfalls, find the shortcuts to full and vibrant health, and a life which allows the fulfilment of our deepest values and dreams. And highlight the importance of reaching out for the help that is there waiting for us. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, Elaine, for that lovely introduction. As Elaine said, I'm Alison McGrath and I'm one of the recovery practitioners with the Chrysalis Effect, and I'm also a former nurse. And I'd like to share with you a little bit about my biography, just to explain some of the context of why I think that it's so important to understand the role that our professional occupations nurses plays in the development of chronic exhaustive conditions, but also for myself, how it was a part of recovering as well. So the exhausted nurse, why nurses are at high risk of chronic exhaustive conditions and how wellbeing coaching can help. And I'm coming at this from my perspective, both as a former nurse and as a recoverer, and now as a wellbeing coach who's supporting other people and particularly nurses on their own recovery journeys. So a little bit about my own background. I began my working career in the army with the Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps, and I was only with them for a year because I had an awful experience of being bullied. But I was with them for long enough to develop a real passion and a sense that nursing was what I should be doing with my life. It was a real powerful connection that even when I left the army meant that I was prepared to do pretty much anything in order to qualify to be a nurse. So I went on to study at the University of Edinburgh, and I qualified with a degree in nursing in 1993. This was a really difficult time to be a student nurse. I don't think there is an easy one, but it was at the time when we were seeing the introduction of trusts, so the fragmentation of the NHS into lots of competing organisations. It was a time when we had the Community Care Act, so patients, a lot of them were being moved from hospitals into the community, often with very little resourcing. But also nurse training was changing. So we had the introduction of Project 2000, in which nurses went from working as part of the team on the wards to being supernumerary. So while I was on the wards as a student nurse and an undergraduate, we saw the sudden disappearance of a large part of that workforce and some real serious problems in coping with the transition between systems. So by the time I graduated, and went on to work in hospital and community nursing, I was already really struggling with nursing to see how I was going to be able to manage to do it. And this tension between this real powerful sense, this is what I was supposed to do, and not being able to put it in practice. So I lasted a few years working in community nursing until I had my first child. And at that point, I was working in the community with a caseload that had an enormous proportion of child protection issues. And I just could not separate out that work from coming home to my own baby. And eventually I had what I suppose would be seen as a mental breakdown, and I was sent home from work. And that was the end of my nursing career in practice. And I was diagnosed with postnatal depression. And as I saw it later, I saw it more as post-NHS depression. But I was still very much attached to nursing. So what I did was I went on to apply to become a postgraduate and study for a PhD. And in the context at the time, there were a lot of shortages. There were a lot of media headlines about nurses quitting and about a loss of vocation, a loss of commitment, which just did not sit at all well with my experience of myself and my colleagues. So I studied for a PhD and I graduated in 2006. And the title was, Should I Stay or Should I Go? Towards an Understanding of Leaving Nursing. And initially I was talking to nurses, I was looking for nurses who'd left. I actually found there were very few of them. And I found that it was more an exploration of why nurses who talked about leaving so much, who were so exhausted and miserable and frustrated, just could not go. They could not leave and go and do something else. Towards the end of that period, I had to move to South Africa for family reasons. And this was the period when I really began to see the physical fallout from all of that tension and frustration, with symptoms of exhaustion on top of the depression and hormonal disturbances translating into physical issues. And at one point I found I was so anemic, I was told that I really should have had a blood transfusion. But I was just powering through thinking, I'm a nurse, I can manage with this, I'm strong, and I should be tired. I'm doing a PhD and I have a small baby, and just completely ignoring all my symptoms in what we see now as phase 1 of denial more than 20 years ago. I came back to live in my home village, and at the time I was really happy about this because I needed to be near my parents. My father was very ill, and for the next 10 years I didn't work. My academic career didn't go anywhere because I was told there was no funding for research into the nursing workforce, and very explicitly by my head of department, who said nursing research is about patients, not nurses. So during that period, I was very, very busy as a young mum, as a carer. I was on every local committee and I filled every moment of the day. After a while, I realised that if I didn't go back to paid work, it wasn't going to happen. I was going to be labelled the family carer and I would spend the rest of my life looking after everybody else and not earning anything. And that was a problem. So I got myself a job as a volunteer coordinator, running a county-wide programme teaching food growing to people, and that was funded through public health. And I absolutely loved that job, but it was during that period that my symptoms really began to ramp up. And I went through that classic succession of appointments with specialist after specialist after specialist, and each one saying, good news, all the tests are clear, you're fine. And just feeling all the time that I was being labelled as a lead swinger, as lazy, and sometimes explicitly finding that because I was a nurse, people were really quite annoyed at me because I was supposed to be a strong nurse, not the patient. And eventually my health crashed completely when my father died. And in 2018, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia and I had to give up my work. I just wasn't physically capable of doing it anymore. I was really lucky in that I found the Chrysalis Effect quite quickly, and I went through the online program and recovered fully, which just still feels quite miraculous. And towards the end of that recovery, I began to work on the support team. And I was receiving the emails, the health profiles that you send into the Chrysalis Effect, describing what's happened to you, what your symptoms are, all that stuff that you don't get asked when you go to the doctor. And it became really apparent what Elaine meant when she talks about this ME profile, that although we're all unique, it's the same story in many ways again and again and again. And that was really quite enlightening for me. And I also began to see how much parallel there was with my thesis and what I'd understood about nurses and their mindset and the identity into which we were being socialised. I was also training at that point, just as an aside, to be a copy editor, which shows the enormous transformation from the brain fog that had stopped me working to being able to do that really detailed work online. But it was still clear that I wanted to be doing something related to my nursing. So in 2021, when I was fully recovered, I trained through a Chrysalis Effect bursary to become a wellbeing coach and a trauma-informed specialist recovery practitioner. And I moved back to Scotland after 20 years, which is really where my heart is and where I'd wanted to be all along. So that at the beginning of this year, in 2023, I founded my business, Campsie Coaching. So now I'm using all of my experiences as a nurse, as a recoverer, and my training to support other people on the recovery journey that I've just been on. And this is just a quick slide to show you some pictures of me in my nursing days. So on the left, we have me little more than a child, really, having just joined the army, very excited, but already by the point that this picture was taken, experiencing bullying and beginning to panic and thinking, how am I going to be able to be a nurse in this context? Middle picture was while I was a student nurse at Edinburgh, and I had a whole month when I went to work in a hospital in Kenya, which was a really transformative experience in my life, but also was the source of some really quite significant traumas in my early career, including I had longed for a long time to be able to see a baby being born, and my first witnessing of a birth was a stillbirth in Kenya, which is something that still haunts me today. And then on the right, this is me as a staff nurse with my little old-fashioned paper hat on, working at the Eastern General Hospital in Edinburgh. And I wanted to share this slide with you because this is a cartoon that was in one of my textbooks as a student, and I copied it and I put it on my wall, and that's come with me ever since. And it really represents for me both why nursing helped me to become ill, but also how it helped me to come out of that illness and to find my way forward through the Chrysalis Effect. So I see this very much as me as I was trained as a student nurse, on that ward round with all these powerful people, the matron and the consultant and the students. And we were trained to ask why. Why are we doing this? Always evidence-based practice. But we were also trained to see that cowering little patient lying there in the bed and to see them as a human being. And that my job as a nurse with my colleagues was to make sure that that patient stayed human, that we related to them as a human being. And so that why question was always really, really important. And later on, when I'd left nursing, I then turned that why question onto myself as the patient. So the doctors were looking at the symptoms and about treating symptoms. I kept asking, yes, but why? What is behind my symptoms all the time? And so it kind of fired me up with that quest to get to the bottom of what was happening for me. And that ultimately is what gave me the energy and kept me going through the years of recovery. So if we look at this question of nurses and chronic exhaustion, there is the question there of how many nurses does this affect? Is it really an issue at all? And if we look at the statistics, there is no evidence really to suggest that there is a particular problem. But that's not because of a lack of evidence, but it's because nobody's actually looking at this at all. So when I studied for my thesis, one of the first things I had to do was to establish how many nurses are there and how many are leaving. And we couldn't even answer that one. There is no set of statistics which even tells us how many nurses there are, because the statistics that are counted tend to double count. So it will count nurses on different parts of the register twice. And also it doesn't reflect who's actually practicing and who might actually have stopped practicing, but is not being asked to re-register for several years. And so there's just this big gaping hole really in our understanding of nursing. And when you carry that forward onto nurses' health and well-being, it's even more apparent. So we just don't know. It's been interesting recently to look at long COVID, because that really has, I think, freaked the powers that be within the NHS and government and those sorts of circles as to, oh my goodness, we think suddenly we've got a large part of the workforce who are stuck at home, who are not getting better, that we don't have any answers for, but we don't know the scale of the problem. So there have been calls to actually count better for long COVID, but still the statistics are not there. So there was a panorama programme at the beginning of 2023 which looked into this a little bit more, and it's extrapolated from the data that has been collected in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, where the suggestion is that 0.6% of the whole workforce, that's all healthcare workers, are currently struggling with long COVID and unable to work. And that then extrapolated would mean about 10,000 people across the UK. Now, that doesn't drill down into how many people are nurses. And I would say at this point, I'm focusing on nurses because I'm a nurse. That's what I understand. But I hope that an awful lot of what I say today will resonate for people who are also in other healthcare professions, but also in social work and in education. I think there are an awful lot of parallels. And I think you might well have some aha moments through just listening to what the nursing perspective is. So if we don't know the actual numbers, why is it that I'm convinced that there is a problem here that we need to understand? Well, that's based in my understanding and what I've seen by working through the Chrysalis Effect. And during the COVID, Elaine introduced the coffee mornings, which I think were absolutely fantastic step forward, where we could actually talk face to face for the first time and not just through the Facebook forum. And you would find if somebody mentioned they were a nurse, then other people would say, yeah, me too, me too. And you began to recognise just how many of us are in that kind of background. But also there's a logic to it. So beginning to understand those patterns and that ME profile, which I'll come to shortly, there is an enormous logic of thinking of the overlap, how much that ME profile actually describes the nursing identity and what brings people into the caring profession. So you would expect that there would be a particular problem in those groups. So what is this ME profile then? Well, I'm just going to quickly run through the elements of it that we describe within the Chrysalis Effect. But while I do this, I think it's worth looking at this lovely mural to the left of the nurse and imagining that she is one of these people with this profile and what it's actually like for her or him working in the NHS or in any kind of practice with this kind of profile. So first and foremost, what we see is that people who tend to develop ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, long COVID, any of these labels, are very much that type A personality. So they're driven and they're perfectionist and they're overachievers. And that might be expressed through work. It might be through their caring in their family. It might be through being driven in exercise. We see lots of people who really are very, very much caught up with extreme exercise. We're also people who are within the category of the highly sensitive person. And this is the work around what Elaine has done, which has some basis in genetics, but also it is very much enhanced by trauma and experience as well. And highly sensitive people feel things very, very deeply. So they will take in much more information from their world around them than other people, and they process it much more deeply. So they are very quickly overwhelmed. They tend to be very sensitive to smells, to sounds, to chemicals. And if you think there within that nursing context of being in the middle of a busy ward where you're working with a lot of chemicals, you're washing your hands, maybe 40, 50 times a day in antibacterial solutions. It's very easy to become overwhelmed. It's a very stressful environment for somebody who's highly sensitive. And then on top of that, we also see that the highly sensitive person tends to be very deeply empathic. So not only will they feel their own world very, very deeply, but they will absorb the emotions of the people around them. And they might not realise that the reason why they're feeling angry or upset or any of these negative emotions is not something that's happening to them, but it's the emotions from other people that they're taking in. And that can be a very, very difficult load to bear and something very difficult to cope with. People who show the ME profile tend to have a very high expectation of themselves. They are overgivers. They tend to put other people before themselves, and they will only rest when everything is done absolutely perfectly. And that I will come back to later as a huge, huge issue when you're working within the nursing profession. We tend to live in our heads, and I talk about we because this very much describes me. We live in our heads, so there's a lot of rumination about the past. So what did I do? Did I get it right? Did I get it wrong? Is it all my fault? But then that also flips over into anxiety about the future. What might happen? What might happen if I get things wrong at work? And we also tend to get a disconnection from the emotions because, frankly, it's just too overwhelming to be able to live with day to day. And so we have this trauma response that I'll come back to later of a kind of chronic level of dissociation, of distancing ourselves from the world around us. There's very often a sense of being a fish out of water or a square peg in a round hole, feelings of never being good enough and not fitting in. And then last but not least, there's a very common experience of being parentified as a child. And this is another very important one when we're looking at nurses and healthcare professions. There's a tendency to have been given responsibility way beyond our years at a very early age. And so it becomes a part of how we understand ourselves and how we ought to operate in the world. So who comes into nursing and why? And there's quite a big literature on this around nursing and other healthcare professions. But childhood experience is incredibly important in that choice when you're a school leaver or in your early adulthood to think, right, okay, I want to be a nurse. And I did a brief survey recently just to touch in with what's happening for nurses now. So I was asking nurses who are currently experiencing chronic exhaustive condition or who have recently recovered about their ways of thinking about nursing and their experience. And the responses I got back from this survey when I asked, why was it you chose nursing as a career? This is the first one that jumped out at me. I was a rescuer. So, you know, this is an identity. I am a person who goes out and rescues other people. Family expectations are hugely important. I enjoyed caring. I wanted to help. And my family were nurses, so that sense of roles already set up that you're going to slot into. And I saw somebody nursing a family member as also a very powerful thing, showing people what nurses do, but also the power for the nurse of how much you get back when you're able to be in that caring position. And from this, we can see that those early childhood experiences of how we learn to understand ourselves and how we understand ourselves in relation to other people. So the role we have in our family, the carer, the supporter, the fixer, leads people towards naturally this kind of a role, whether it's nursing or social work or medicine or anything else. I wanted to share this picture with you as well. I don't know how many people will recognize who this is. So why do nurses develop chronic exhaustive conditions? I want to take us right back in history to the origins of modern nursing. And this is actually a picture of Florence Nightingale. And people are very familiar with the image of the lady with the lamp and her being in the Crimea and her powerful presence in working against often medicine and against the powers that be to establish the need for a nursing profession that was really organised. And Florence Nightingale's view of nursing was very much based in the idea of the family. So she was quite explicit about this, that in the hospital, the doctor is the father and he's in charge, and the nurse is the mother who does the nurturing and the caring and the healing, and the patient is the child. So quite a disempowering view of nursing. And we might think, well, that's, you know, that's Victorian ages. Is that still relevant at all? So I'm going to come on in a minute to a quote that I used in my thesis that shows just how relevant those early ideas are to nurses today. But I want to go back to this, why this picture of Florence Nightingale and not the picture of the lady with the lamp? or indeed actually the lady with the hammer, which was her other title. The reason she was given that was because when she needed something and the doctor said no, she took a hammer to the padlock on the storerooms. And that was more how she was known amongst the medical profession at the time, the lady with the hammer. But this is Florence in her old age. At the age of 37, she went to bed. And she stayed there for the next 11 years, and she spent the rest of her life as a recluse and an invalid, are the words that are used around her. But at the same time, she's recorded as having worked 16-hour days in bed and being really driven by this sense that she had a debt to pay and that there were millions of people still out there that she had to save. And that is such a familiar picture now. So we can't apply the diagnoses of today. We don't know why she went to bed, but I think there's a very strong suggestion there that Florence Nightingale herself probably had a chronic exhaustive condition, if you look at those patterns. So the nursing profession that she established produced this quote, which I came across early on in my studies and hit me in the stomach like somebody had kicked me. And I used it, I shared it with the nurses that I was interviewing just to see if it had the same resonance for them. And although much of it is very outdated, there was still enough in there that was recognizable that they went, oh my God, yes. So I'll read it out for you now. No lesson is harder to learn for the new nurse than that of discipline. The subordination of her will, unquestioning, to that of another. She must bend under a law which is by no means always a law of love, never ask why, and as seldom as possible how. Be content to bear unmerited blame without murmuring, to be scolded for mistakes that were made in all good faith. She must not be surprised to find herself vehemently repressed if she ventures on the faintest suggestion. And generally, if she is at all forward or clever, she will be put in her right place. Among all the good qualities which a perfect nurse should possess, a little of that courage of endurance, that spirit of self-sacrifice, which was so important a point with the old religious sisters, would not be a bad thing. Cheerful obedience to discipline, the idea of accepting restraint in any spirit but a hostile one, loyalty to superiors, faithful submission to subordination, are the very rarest virtues of them all. Yet it is the spirit of self-sacrificing loyalty that leads to the highest and truest discipline, that remains loyally silent over its own wrongs and punctilious to a fault in the fulfillment of its duties. No life is more hard to live nobly than a life of loyal servitude. And that was Miss Mollett, who was a London matron in 1888, and almost certainly one of those original Nightingale nurses, being at that position at that time. So a really powerful quote, which really should be outdated, and yet which was still resonating with me and with my fellow nurses in the beginning of the 21st century. So I want to look a bit now at the issue of nurses and trauma, because I think this is really what lies at the heart of how nurses really struggle with their work. And trauma we can understand as being a very subjective thing. The important thing is not the experience, but how the person experiences it. And we can understand it as being a situation in which they feel that the resources they have don't match the challenge, the demands that are being made on them, and they become overwhelmed. And that's trauma across the board. So within nursing, we talk about adverse childhood experiences quite a lot at the Chrysalis Effect. And I've touched a bit here on what sort of a person becomes a nurse. And really going sometimes back to birth with problems with attachment disorders, but also that family dynamic, what the child's experiences are that set them up for a whole lifetime of beliefs and behaviours. How should they behave towards other people? What are their responsibilities? What's important? And that all feeds into the person who actually then chooses to become the nurse. And without going into a lot of detail here, some of that foundational research into adverse childhood experiences establishes the connection between those early traumas and later chronic conditions across the board, but chronic exhaustive conditions is very much part of that. So thinking about the workplace, so what happens to that that person who comes into nursing often with a high ACE score, has already had trauma as a child. And they come into a situation in which small t traumas are almost normal. And by small t traumas, I mean those things which overwhelm on a kind of constant drip day-to-day basis. So in childhood, they may have had small t traumas by being regularly humiliated within the family, or living in a situation which was very unstable. So maybe they had parents who had depression or illnesses, they had to look after them. And so every day was about, how can I keep safe? What do I need to do to make everything okay now? And on the wards, that translates into a situation where we have an NHS where the word crisis has been used since the 1940s. And already by the time I did my thesis at the beginning of the 21st century, that was really beginning to feel like a word that was so overused it was meaningless. The NHS is just by definition in crisis all the time. And what we've seen then with the pandemic is it escalating beyond anything I think that we can really fully comprehend, and the kind of situations that we saw people within the health service working through the pandemic, I think were quite traumatizing for people on the outside, never mind those who were actually having to do it. One of the interesting things I found was I thought I'd come to terms with leaving nursing until we were called out to clap. And I just felt such intense guilt that I wasn't there. I'm feeling quite teary now at the moment with this, that I should have been there and that I'd abandoned my colleagues. So that small t trauma, going into work, feeling overwhelmed, not having the physical resources, not having enough people to do the work, often means that you're in a constant state of not being able to meet the demands that are being made upon you, and living in a constant state of fight or flight, and the body being in that high stress level all the time. And we add on top of that the direct traumatic experiences that nurses have. Now, this might be, for example, we know that there is a very high rate of abuse of staff. So verbal abuse, but sometimes even physical attacks from patients, from their families. We get very high pressure situations, and that often translates over into attacks on staff. So it's not only the traumatic experiences of that, but the possibility that it might happen, being aware that the tension's building up. We also have a real serious problem, I think, within the nursing profession with bullying, and that's been well documented. And that's really not surprising when you think that this is a group which actually has very limited power to control its own workload, its own context, and that what happens in groups like that is often that tension is turned inward against each other. And I quite often find that people outside nursing are very surprised, because you would associate nursing with care. Nurses are really caring people. And that is the case for the vast majority of nurses, and particularly in relation to their patients. But nurses can also be really vicious to each other. And I think sometimes that's something that people from the outside are really quite surprised about. In fact, I came across an article while I was studying that said, why do nurses eat their own young? And my first response was, what? Yeah, that's really a bit extreme. And then I thought, no, but we do. Some of the things that student nurses are subjected to by other nurses are really, really quite brutal. So just to give you a couple of examples from my own experience. My very first week on the wards when I arrived in Edinburgh, I was terrified, and my whole class were talking about, oh, what if somebody has a cardiac arrest and I don't know what to do, and really catastrophizing around this stuff. And we were going into a situation where that potentially could happen. And for me, it did. So in my very first week on the wards, I was asked to take the tea trolley around, which seemed a very simple thing, but I approached a man sitting up in bed and I said, would you like a cup of tea? And he keeled over and died. And all of a sudden, I was in the middle of this whirl of activity with curtains swishing and people rushing to the bedside. And all I could do as a new student nurse was cling on to my tea trolley. And I remember the charge nurse saying, just keep going. Go and give everybody a cup of tea and keep it all calm. And that was the last conversation I had about that experience. Nobody came to me later on in that shift and said, are you okay? Nobody, not the other students, not the staff. and I went home in absolute pieces. But what I'd learned was that my job when things went to hell was just to keep going and to keep smiling. And that was a really powerful lesson, and one that fed into my illness later on. Another experience is, again, as a student, I was on accident emergency at the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh on a Saturday night. And the charge nurse said, "Can you sit with this man?" And he was lying on a gurney. He really, really did look unwell. So I did, and I sat with him. And then he rolled over, he vomited all over the floor, and he died. And I rushed over to the charge nurse. I was calling for help. And she said, "Oh, I thought that was going to happen. I just didn't want him to be on his own." And again, that was the end of the conversation. I was just left with that. What do I do? I'm a nurse. That's what I've got to do. On to the next patient. And that really is brutal when you've just often come out of school. You're just early into the profession. These are really powerful lessons about how you behave and what's being expected of you. You have to be strong, and you have to be able to cope with whatever is thrown at you. Then we come on to the question of vicarious trauma. And this is when you're in a situation where you are watching other people who are being overwhelmed. And inevitably, as a nurse, as a doctor, as anybody working on wards, you're coming across this on an almost daily basis. You're faced with illness and disability and death and fear. And remember back to that ME profile of the empath. If you don't understand that you're an empath, you're soaking up all this emotion on the wards, and then you don't have the tools, you don't know what to do with it. So what you tend to do is you dissociate from it, you push it away. And this leads us on to the last aspect of trauma that I'd like to touch on. And this is actually something I can only talk from my own experience. And this is normalized trauma. And I have not been able to find this written about anywhere, except in relation to race. So there is somebody who has talked about normalized trauma where there is racial abuse, and where a group of people, again, have no power to actually change what happens to them. So they tend to just say, that's life, get on with it. And that's very much what happens in nursing. And I don't think I really fully understood that actually until this year. And what really brought it home to me was watching movies with my kids who really like Marvel films. And there's quite a lot of violence in there. And I suddenly realized that I kept having to look away. And I didn't want to see the dismemberments and the blood and the violence and everything. And yet in the past as a nurse, I was really proud of not being squeamish and thinking I can go into the worst situation and just, right, okay, what do we do here? And I'll be fine. And it doesn't touch me. But having been through the recovery process and having been through some trauma therapy and worked on my dissociation, I've lost that defense. And it is really very difficult to watch that sort of thing now. And another aspect of this is that when I was being investigated by a neurologist, I had a pinprick test done. So she stuck pins into my hands to see whether I could feel them. And I couldn't. It just felt like pressure. And I went home and I tested myself, my whole body. And I found that there were, I think, actually a band around my waist where if you stuck a pin in me, I could feel it as a pinprick. And otherwise, it was just pressure. My mind had become completely disconnected from the signals that my body was giving. And I think that was very much tied up with my pain and my fibromyalgia, as I was no longer actually in my body anymore. But having gone through the recovery process and addressed those traumas and reconnected, if you stick a pin in me now, it very much will hurt. So please don't. But that's the power of normalized trauma, to go through your life thinking, oh, that's normal, that's every day, I can cope with it, it'll be fine. Which leads me into this question of the nursing identity. What is it that nurses are trained to believe about themselves and each other? And this very much ties into the image of the superhero, which is quite often talked about. So on the left here, we have quite an old image, a sort of very 1950s style nurse flying to the rescue, the nurse is on her way. But we had an explosion of these kind of images during the COVID pandemic. And particularly, you see these sort of Marvel cartoons where the nurses are sort of incorporated into this whole universe of superheroes. And we also get a lot of talk about nurses as angels. And none of it is human. The nurse is not a human being. The nurse has to be the superhero who is strong and powerful and will come to other people's rescue. And that is really a very difficult identity to live with, but it's also a very difficult identity to let go of. It's very powerful. And I think I touched earlier on about this sense of watching as a child when a nurse looks after a relative. When you have that first experience of being with a patient and you transform their life, you keep them human. You make it possible for them to be able to carry on within that hospital setting or to deal with their grief or their illness. It's a really powerful feeling that hooks you back into that work, and you want to have that again. So you want to be the superhero. And it's really good to think, I am powerful. I can cope with anything. And we really cling on to that, I think, at the same time as having an inkling that this is really not good. So that nursing identity is not just about the individual, about how I feel about myself, but it's also about the group. And there's very much a strong sense that as a nurse, you are part of a team of superheroes and you all depend on each other. And anybody who shows any kind of weakness is letting their colleagues down as well. So if you are not a superhero enough to get to the end of your shift and have done all the work, and you go home, you've dumped that, would be the phrase, I suppose, on your colleagues. And that really is not allowable, regardless of whether that workload was a reasonable one. Or if I remember a time where I came out of laying out the body of somebody that I'd been nursing, so a very emotional situation, coming out of that room to be faced by a relative who wanted me to put flowers in a vase and was very agitated that this was the most important thing at the time. And I had to flip instantly into put on the smile, because the superhero nurse has got to be there for that relative and their crisis. As much as for the person who was behind the door behind me, who I'd just been laying out, having just died. And so the superhero has to be able to do this on the flip of a hat, cope with whatever's thrown at them, regardless. And what underpins a lot of this superhero stuff is a real sense of fear of what happens if you fail. And this is an advert, a recruitment poster from World War I to encourage people to come into the Red Cross. And it baffles me as to why this might even remotely attract people. I suppose it's a very romantic image of the beautiful young nurse. But the message there, I think, is still very much one that people recognise. If I fail, he dies. And what I heard again and again in my thesis was nurses who would say, if I don't keep going, if I'm not strong enough, if I'm not the superhero, somebody is going to die. And a mounting fear as their workloads get bigger and it becomes harder and harder to meet their own and other people's expectations. Somebody's going to die. And I used to think that when somebody died, that maybe people would change things and start listening. But I was present on several occasions where patients died because we didn't have the resources, where we failed, and nothing changed, which was incredibly demoralizing. And I actually found that some of the nurses who had made that decision to leave nursing completely, this was at the heart of it, because the way they argued it was, if I get it wrong and somebody dies, it's my registration on the line. I'm going to be blamed. But more importantly, I shouldn't be carrying on in this situation when I know it's dangerous. I'm actually not doing the patients a service. So I am going to leave. I'm going to make a stand and say this is not good enough. But at the heart of that decision was the patient, not the nurse. Even though in the background there was this sense of, really, I shouldn't be expected to do this. It's about what happens to him. Is he going to die because I can't do my job? So how do nurses cope with this situation? And I've talked about this already, this sense of disconnect from the emotions. And this is another cartoon from the same book that I showed earlier, which really shows how nurses do respond, and that as a group, actually, they tend to disappear and to become faceless, because there is so little power to actually influence what's going on around them and what they're being asked to do. And for a very long time, there's been huge, huge resistance to the idea of striking, because the bottom line was that would hurt patients. Regardless, we have to just take it all on ourselves, because the patient is all that matters. And very interesting, that is something when I asked myself now, doing the more recent survey, what's changed, is that we see images of nurses who are out on the streets with banners and they are striking. That is huge, absolutely huge. But I have to ask, what's behind that? How much of that is, we shouldn't have to take this anymore? And that's very definitely there now in ways it wasn't before. But there's still that line of, we have to defend the patients, and patients are already dying. So we have to do something about this situation. So looking at a little bit more, what I was looking at in my thesis was, what are these expectations? What does nursing mean? What is it that people are pushing themselves so hard to try and achieve? And why are they struggling so much with it? And what came through time and again is a word that, again, is very, very familiar within the Chrysalis Effect, is this issue of boundaries. And nursing really is, it's an experience of juggling a role that has no limits, where you're not supposed to have personal boundaries. You're not supposed to say, no, I can't manage that. That's not good for me. You're not allowed to say, that's not my job. But nurses really, really struggle to describe what it is that nursing is. And this is a conversation that's been going on in nursing circles since it began, I think. What is nursing? What counts as the nursing role and what isn't? So that you know when you can say no or not. And as part of this work, I developed a couple of diagrams, and I hope this is not too technical here, but I'll take you through them, to explain how nursing is viewed now and how nurses understand it. So this diagram, the red circle, represents the multidisciplinary teams, so all the people who are working together within health to support the patient back to recovery or to the optimal health that they can achieve if they're not going to recover. And it's very much a kind of silo mentality. So each occupation has its own specialism. So the doctors do diagnosis and treatment of disease, and the counsellors or the psychiatrists deal with mental illness and can support. Physiotherapists and the occupational therapists are looking at movement and function. And the pharmacist is dealing with the drugs, and the dietitian is dealing with nutrition. So where in this very common model of understanding roles in a workplace do nurses fit? Because a nurse very often will pick up the information which is diagnostic and take it to the doctor, and then have to play this doctor-nurse game, which we were explicitly taught, so that they can tell the doctor what they think's wrong without the doctor thinking that the nurse is doing the diagnosis. We'll spend hours, particularly on a night shift sometimes, sitting talking to people using counselling skills. In the absence of weekends and out of hours, we will carry on with patients' physiotherapy exercises or occupational therapy. So as a nurse, when I was helping somebody to have a bath, I was very much using occupational therapy principles to get them to move in particular ways and to exercise the parts that they needed to as part of that activity of daily living. I was also expected to understand the drugs I was giving. So I needed to know what the drug was, what the side effects were, what was the normal dose. So if I made an error in giving out those drugs, even though I hadn't prescribed them, then I was held accountable. But was I a pharmacist? And the kind of nurses get lost in this, that they're doing a little bit of everybody else's job, but they can't say, what is it that I'm doing as a nurse that makes me a nurse and not a physiotherapist or a doctor? And the other thing in this diagram, I think it really stands out, is that isolation of the patient in the middle, who's having things done to them by all of these different groups. And where is the nurse in this? So based on my interviews with nurses and their understanding of what it was they were trying to achieve and that they were so frustrated about, I put together this diagram. So you still have that red circle, which is the multidisciplinary healthcare team. And you still have all of these different specialisms, but there is now the blue circle of nursing activity, which actually overlaps with all of them. So nurses need to know a little bit of everything, and a lot of them would talk about being a jack of all trades because they're filling the gaps. They would also talk about being a project manager or about the glue or the lubrication that makes things work. And above all, seeing the big picture with the patient in the center of it, making it all happen. And then at the center of this, instead of an isolated patient who's been dehumanized, labeled as a patient, you have the nurse with that patient and with the family. And what nurses were trying to do was to keep those people human within a really dehumanizing situation. So they would get to know those people, and they would share what they learnt about them with the rest of the team, so that their care could be individualized. But they will also understand the system, so that they can interpret for the patient and their family and let them know what's going on, and guide and navigate and walk alongside them through their experience of being ill. And so it's a totally different way of understanding quite what it is that you're going to do, and it's very much at odds with the dominant models. And that really was at the heart of the problem that nurses were having. This is what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to do it in a system that works like a factory that dehumanizes. And it dehumanizes the patient, and it dehumanizes me. So a little bit now more about external expectations. I've talked a lot about the nursing profession. But what are nurses dealing with in terms of other people's expectations of them? And this, I think, is a really powerful image, again, one that came out of COVID. And I think it's supposed to be a positive one. The strength of that nurse and the angel wings, again, always the angel wings, holding up the world. But for me, I feel an almost physical pressure down. I can feel the weight of that world that that nurse is carrying. And I find it a very, very disturbing picture. And I found it quite disturbing during COVID with the clapping for carers. And we've seen since, I think, quite a lot of resentment. What happened to that clapping and all those plaudits for nurses when it actually came to saying, you're human beings, you need better conditions and you need better pay? So within the NHS, there is very much that expectation that a nurse should be able to hold up the world. The nurse should be able to keep the NHS going, whatever the situation. And that is reflected in the NHS constitution, which says that for us, it's the patient first and always. That's also reflected in the RCN's documentation. So there is a booklet on stress and how to manage stress, how to look after yourself. And the first reason that's given why you should look after yourself is that you can't look after patients. Not that your mental health and your physical health are really important because you are human and you are special, but because the patient needs you. And this kind of binary view of the nurse is the strong carer, the patient is the person who's dependent, makes it hugely problematic when you become ill as a nurse. And it shapes the way you feel about yourself. So it intensifies all of these feelings of guilt and failure. It makes admitting vulnerability incredibly hard to do on your own. But it also means that you might have to face being penalized by other people because you are a nurse and you are a patient. And I've had that on many occasions of being slapped down or criticized because I'm supposed to be strong and I'm not. And that carries over into wider society's expectations of nurses as well. And I think it's really interesting to see the contrast between what happened between the clapping for nurses and this outpouring of affection and support, and how quickly we then turned to headlines where nurses were actually being vilified and attacked on the wards because they were delivering vaccines. And it's very hard to kind of navigate that space of when other people are sort of raising you to the roof at one minute because you are an angel or a superhero, which is usually followed by, I couldn't do that job. But at the same time, you might be actually in danger because of the work you're doing. And then if we bring that in a little bit further to family expectations of nurses and back to that issue of your role within the family. So you might already have been allocated the role of carer and fixer and being a parentified child. When you become a nurse, there's an even more powerful expectation that you're the one in the family who should be swooping in and sorting everything out when people become ill. And I saw that very much, both in my own expectations, but that of my own family, when I came back from South Africa to be essentially near my father, who was very ill. But he was ill for 10 years before he died. And the whole burden of that care, of being with him, of keeping him human as we navigated the NHS, of making sure that he had the level of care that I wanted for him, all fell on me. That wasn't to say that my siblings didn't do anything, but I was the one who was responsible, and they could quite easily duck out and say, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I was the one who had to make sure it all happened regardless and make all those sacrifices. And people do expect nurses to do this in ways that maybe they don't for other occupations. I don't know, I suppose if you have a lawyer in the family, you probably take your legal questions to them. But there's an intimacy and a disturbance of family relationships when you actually find yourself literally having to wipe a parent's backside when they've just been to the toilet, for example. It really does mess up those family dynamics. So just a quick run through a nurse's journey through chronic exhaustion. So this is me as that young staff nurse on the wards, already really beginning to struggle. So what do nurses do in that first phase when they're denying it, when they're hanging on to that, I'm strong, I can cope with this? And I've talked about this chronic trauma response of dissociation, but we soothe ourselves. So you see high levels amongst nurses of smoking, of drinking, of comfort eating, and that's particularly a problem when patients keep bringing in chocolate. So you're on the wards often surrounded by chocolate all the time, and not taking meals properly. Some nurses will actually go down the exercise route. So at the end of a really hard physical shift, they'll go to the gym and push themselves even further and adding to the load on their body. Some nurses will be too exhausted, they'll go home and they'll crash and they'll just binge on Netflix or social media. And all of these things are self-soothing tools to try and hold back the fear and all that emotional stuff that are just too hard to cope with. Another way of dealing with this is that nurses will quite often tend to move between jobs. And actually this maybe dips into phase 3 that we see in the Chrysalis Effect as well, where people will go from therapist to therapist to therapist looking for an external reason why things are wrong. So maybe this therapist has the answer and will make me right. Well, the nurse will go to a new job. So I move to the community. Maybe in the community, I can find the place where I can nurse as I want to and it'll all be all right. And I think this was partly what was generating these headlines about nurses leaving. And they were actually looking at nurses who were leaving a job and saying they were leaving nursing altogether and generating this huge panic. And actually they were just sort of milling around, going from job to job to job, and specialism to specialism to try and work out where they fitted, because we never really felt that we fitted properly. And sadly, many nurses will crash, and we've seen that particularly with long COVID, of nurses who find themselves driven, really still driven as carers, desperately needing to earn an income, but stuck at home and told that there is no hope, there's no way forward. And also what we've seen around long COVID is a deliberate changing of the policies around support, sickness benefit, so that they're no longer able to continue on a livable income. So they are stuck, not able to work anymore, but the money is being taken away. And some nurses are actually being dismissed and losing their work altogether. And that's not just a financial disaster, but when your whole identity is bound up with this strong carer, it's an incredible, difficult thing to face a future where you're going to be the dependent one and where you are the lazy one, the lead swinger, the person, oh, she's still tired. Moving on to phase 4, this is the real powerful point of change for me. And this is that shift from that external search for things that will make it all better into, okay, I need to change what I'm doing here. And it's recognizing that those values and those beliefs, those behaviors, that's what I was looking for. That was the driver underneath all of my symptoms. So when I had my hormonal problems, and the medical profession's response to that was, oh, well, we'll give you a hysterectomy. And eventually I did actually have a womb ablation. That was just, let's knock that symptom on the head. And I was saying to them, but what about my hormones? I know as a nurse, I know from my training that somewhere in there is an imbalance in my hormones. Can I see a hormone specialist? No. So phase 4, coming to the Chrysalis Effect, I finally had those physiological answers. I had it laid out in front of me and I was thinking, that's what I wanted. This is what I knew as a nurse. There is a physiological as well as a psychological reason why I have all these symptoms. And now I understand that, I can share that with other people and help them to find those answers. But also I can help people to go through that internal search of what is it? What is it about the way I'm behaving and thinking that's getting me into such trouble, and how do I change it? And then we go through that phase 5 of relearning and relapse, where we start changing something and then we fall off the wagon, and then we beat ourselves up and feel guilty, and then you have to get back on the wagon again and try. And gradually those relapses get further apart until finally you actually know how to look after yourself, and you've left behind a lot of those old patterns of thinking, and looking after yourself is a part of every day. And that's where I am now. So this final picture here is of me this summer, actually, in a friend's kayak on a loch in Scotland, learning how to row. Something that I really thought back in my early days of crash, when I was struggling to even get up to go to the toilet, that was never ever going to happen for me again. This next slide is just a bit of a light-hearted one. This is a book that I have facing me on my bookshelf to remind me of where I've come from. This is the very first book I ever learned to read. And before I could actually read, I knew it by rote. And on every page, this little red hen asks for help in harvesting the grain and then planting it and harvesting it again, making it into bread. And every time she asks for help, the answer is, "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the dog. And then the little red hen says, "I should do it myself," said the little red hen. So at the age of 3, I was already learning this. If I want something done, nobody's going to help me. I have to learn to do it myself. But I've now learned to actually put that aside and think in very different ways. So how do I work now as a wellbeing coach and a trauma-informed recovery specialist? And why is wellbeing coaching so important, I think, particularly for nurses who are going through the recovery process? So what we have here is the 8 elements wheel. And I hope that actually maybe is familiar from the earlier slides I've shown you about this wheel, this circle. Keep coming back to this circle. And so with the 8 elements wheel, we divide our life up into these 8 segments, and you have to address every single one of these if you're really going to get well again. And that we use it as a tool for seeing which part should we focus on now. And that it dawned on me that actually as a coach, I've gone full circle and I'm using my nursing skills and I'm doing the same thing. So for me, the coach is actually the structure here. I don't work in nutritional health or movement or environment. Those are not my specialisms. My specialism is the whole big picture. So as a wellbeing coach, myself and my colleagues, we can help create that outer rim and those boundaries when you're really struggling to find your own. And we can help you to develop your own boundaries. And we can help you to find some structure in knowing where to go on your recovery journey next. So what can a trauma-informed wellbeing coach offer? How can we help you to shortcut your recovery, particularly if you're a nurse? I think first and foremost, we can give you an informed outsider perspective on that big picture, and we will often talk about the water you swim in. So as a nurse, I really didn't see just how toxic a lot of my thinking was, or the expectations were of me. Having been swimming in that water that you might be in now, and having learned how to come out and look back, I can help you to see that big picture too. And I can help you to unpick some of that stuff that's been in there since childhood. But also because I'm a nurse, I'm very familiar with it, which I think gives an added dimension there to being able to communicate with you and to understand really what it is that's happening for you. I can also offer you support through the fear of facing a vulnerability, and I do understand just how difficult it is when you've really from childhood been used to being the strong one and there's all those expectations. And to being the super nurse and the protection it gives you, that sense of I can cope with anything, to actually face that vulnerability that really is at the heart of everybody being a human being. And I understand that actually I think nurses in many ways are less likely to reach out and ask for the help that they need, even when they most need it, to be able to face that vulnerability and to make the changes in their lives. So I would urge you, if you're a nurse and if you're feeling you're really getting stuck with your recovery, not to keep ploughing on your own, but to reach out and ask for the help that is available for there, because I think that's where the real strength actually lies, not in the ploughing on. I can also help you with your boundary setting, and that goes back to that coaching wheel again, and establishing where is it appropriate to have a boundary, where should I have boundaries in my life, and where is it okay to have those, and what is it okay for people to ask me and not ask me. But also It's one thing to work out where your boundaries should be, and it's another one to be able to stick to them. So how do you interact with other people? What do you do when they ask you to do something that you don't want to? And with a coach, you can work through that. You can plan, what are you going to say? What are you going to do? You know, we can even role play that. I can also offer you accountability and encouragement. Recovery is really always about taking baby steps, doing something every day that takes you in the right direction towards your recovery. And it is so much easier to do and to change those habits if, rather than relying on willpower, you tell somebody else. So you work out with your coach what that goal is going to be to take you forward. And you set that accountability and you let your coach know when you've done it. It makes it so much easier to actually keep on track, as people keep talking about, to keep moving forward with those baby steps. I can also offer you a safe space and an open ear for your trauma. As a nurse, I have been through an awful lot myself. So not only will I, as a wellbeing coach, create that safe space in which you can explore some of that stuff, but you don't necessarily have to explain it all to me, because we've got a common language. We've both been there to some extent. And I also, although I'm not a trauma therapist myself, I work very closely with people who can offer you trauma support. And so if that's something that comes up on your, or probably will come up on your recovery journey, then I can refer you to the person that you do need to work with at the appropriate point. I can also be honest with you as to whether I think that trauma referral or any other referral is going to be helpful for you at that point in your recovery journey. And sometimes we want to launch into dealing with the trauma, getting it all over very early on, when actually we're still very physically depleted. And if that's the case with you, I'll be honest with you and we can talk about where the steps forward are that you need to take. Yeah, so I can offer you referrals to other specialists whenever appropriate. I can also help you to develop a vision of the life you want. And it was really striking when I was doing my thesis just how limited so many people's sense of their options were. So they would tell me, I'm a nurse, what else can I be? I had the experience when people asked me what my degree was in, and I would say nursing, and they go, pardon, nothing? And I really took that to heart. There's this sense of nursing is nothing. You are just a nurse. You are only supposed to stay being a nurse. Some people actually being told off. You shouldn't even be thinking of leaving nursing because we have such a crisis of staffing. Nurses have an incredible skill set, which really isn't recognised. So we have vast amounts of medical knowledge, all of that overlap with other healthcare professionals, but we also have really, really developed skills in communication and in support, which carry over beautifully into a whole range of the areas. So it may be that you really do want to go back to nursing, and I can help you with that, to develop those boundaries, that sense of what you want from work when you go back, and being able to negotiate that. Or it may be that I can help you to see, well, what is the heart of what nursing means to you? And is there a different place in the way that I've found now with wellbeing coaching? Is there something else where you can use those skills and get that really strong sense of fulfillment and life purpose? And that's something that I think, again, it is so much easier if you can do it with somebody else as your sounding board, who will listen to what you're saying, reflect back and ask the key questions. So yeah, I can help you to recognise that as a nurse, you are incredibly skilled and talented and empathic, and there are just so many options available for you in life, and that recovery doesn't have to mean going back to what made you ill. And that really is, I think, tapping into that issue of secondary gain. So as a nurse, is there something inside you which really doesn't want to recover? And often it's so deeply embedded that we don't recognise that maybe this is the first time you've ever really been looked after, and you don't want to let go of that. Or maybe it is more that fear of, I don't want to go back to that life. So I can help you to unpick all of that stuff and to really recognise the amazing person that you are and all the possibilities that are ahead of you. So this is me. This is back to this picture of me on the water, me having come full circle from those early days in nursing to now using really, I feel, all of my nursing skills and knowledge and combining that with my experience as a recoverer and all my training at the Chrysalis Effect to be able to offer that to you to help you on your own recovery journey. And really what I see is that my role is to walk alongside you, helping you to navigate this path. So I'd love you to get in touch, and I do offer a half-hour free discovery call so that you can get in touch with me, no strings attached, just to talk through how I might be able to help you. And these are my contact details if you want to do that. So thanks very much for listening, and thank you so much for Elaine for inviting me to do this today.